But it works. Fictions enable us to cooperate better. The price we pay is that the same fictions also determine the goals of our cooperation. So we may have very elaborate systems of cooperation, which are harnessed to serve fictional aims and interests. Consequently, the system may seem to be working well, but only if we adopt the system's own criteria. For example, a Muslim mullah would say, "Our system works." There are now 1.5 billion Muslims worldwide, and more people study the Quran and submit themselves to Allah's will than ever before. The key question, though, is whether this is the right yardstick for measuring success. A school principal would say, "Our system works." During the last 5 years, exam results have risen by 7.3%. Yet is that the best way to judge a school? An official in ancient Egypt would say, "Our system works. We collect more taxes, dig more canals and build bigger pyramids than anyone else in the world." True enough, pharaonic Egypt led the world in taxation, irrigation and pyramid construction. But is that what really counts? People have many material, social and mental needs. It is far from clear that peasants in ancient Egypt enjoyed more love, or better social relations than their hunter-gatherer ancestors, and in terms of nutrition, health and child mortality, it seems that life was actually worse. A document, dated circa 1850 BC from the reign of Amenemhat III, the pharaoh, who created Lake Fayum, tells of a well-to-do man, called Duoketi, who took his son Pepi to school, so that he could learn to be a scribe. On the way to school, Duoketi portrayed the miserable life of peasants, laborers, soldiers and artisans, so as to encourage Pepi to devote all his energy to studying, thereby escaping the destiny of most humans. According to Duoketi, the life of a landless field laborer is full of hardship and misery. Dressed in mere tatters, he works all day till his fingers are covered in blisters. Then Pharaoh's officials come and take him away to do forced labor. In return for all his hard work, he receives only sickness as payment. Even if he makes it home alive, he will be completely worn out and ruined. The fate of the land-holding peasant is hardly better. He spends his days carrying water in buckets from the river to the field. The heavy load bends his shoulders and covers his neck with festering swellings. In the morning he has to water his plot of leeks, in the afternoon his date palms, and in the evening his coriander field. Eventually he drops down and dies. 8 The text might exaggerate things on purpose, but not by much. Pharaonic Egypt was the most powerful kingdom of its day, but for the simple peasant all that power meant taxes, and forced labor rather than clinics, and social security services. This was not a uniquely Egyptian defect. Despite all the immense achievements of the Chinese dynasties, the Muslim empires and the European kingdoms, even in AD 1850 the life of the average person was not better, and might actually have been worse than the lives of archaic hunter-gatherers. In 1850 a Chinese peasant, or a Manchester factory hand worked longer hours than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Their jobs were physically harder and mentally less fulfilling. Their diet was less balanced. Hygiene conditions were incomparably worse, and infectious diseases were far more common. Suppose you were given a choice between the following 2 vacation packages. Stone Age package. On day 1 we will hike for 10 hours in a pristine forest, setting camp for the night in a clearing by a river. On day 2 we will canoe down the river for 10 hours, camping on the shores of a small lake. On day 3 we will learn from the native people how to fish in the lake and how to find mushrooms in the nearby woods. Modern proletarian package. On day 1 we will work for 10 hours in a polluted textile factory, passing the night in a cramped apartment block. On day 2 we will work for 10 hours as cashiers in the local department store, going back to sleep in the same apartment block. On day 3 we will learn from the native people how to open a bank account and fill out mortgage forms. Which package would you choose? Hence, when we come to evaluate human cooperation networks, it all depends on the yardsticks and viewpoint we adopt. Are we judging pharaonic Egypt in terms of production, nutrition, or perhaps social harmony? Do we focus on the aristocracy, the simple peasants, or the pigs and crocodiles? History isn't a single narrative, but thousands of alternative narratives. Whenever we choose to tell one, we are also choosing to silence others. Human cooperative networks usually judge themselves by yardsticks of their own invention, and not surprisingly, they often give themselves high marks. In particular, human networks built in the name of imaginary entities such as gods, nations, and corporations normally judge their success from the viewpoint of the imaginary entity. A religion is successful if it follows divine commandments to the letter, a nation is glorious if it promotes the national interest, and a corporation thrives if it makes a lot of money. When examining the history of any human network, it is therefore advisable to stop from time to time and look at things from the perspective of some real entity. How do you know if an entity is real? Very simple, just ask yourself, can it suffer? When people burn down the temple of Zeus, Zeus doesn't suffer. When the euro loses its value, the euro doesn't suffer. When a bank goes bankrupt, the bank doesn't suffer. When a country suffers a defeat in war, the country doesn't really suffer. It's just a metaphor. In contrast, when a soldier is wounded in battle, he really does suffer. When a famished peasant has nothing to eat, she suffers. When a cow is separated from her newborn calf, she suffers. This is reality. Of course, suffering might well be caused by our belief in fictions. For example, belief in national and religious myths might cause the outbreak of war, in which millions lose their homes, their limbs, and even their lives. The cause of war is fictional, but the suffering is 100% real. This is exactly why we should strive to distinguish fiction from reality. Fiction isn't bad. It is vital. Without commonly accepted stories about things like money, states, or corporations, no complex human society can function. We can't play football unless everyone believes in the same made-up rules, and we can't enjoy the benefits of markets and courts without similar make-believe stories. But the stories are just tools. They should not become our goals or our yardsticks. When we forget that they are mere fiction, we lose touch with reality. Then we begin entire wars to make a lot of money for the corporation, or to protect the national interest. Corporations, money, and nations exist only in our imagination. We invented them to serve us. How come we find ourselves sacrificing our lives in their service? Chapter 5. The Odd Couple. Stories serve as the foundations and pillars of human societies. As history unfolded, stories about gods, nations, and corporations grew so powerful that they began to dominate objective reality. Believing in the great god Sobek, the mandate of heaven, or the Bible enabled people to build Lake Fayum, the Great Wall of China, and Chartres Cathedral. Unfortunately, blind faith in these stories meant that human efforts frequently focused on increasing the glory of fictional entities such as gods and nations, instead of bettering the lives of real sentient beings. Does this analysis still hold true today? At first sight, it seems that modern society is very different from the kingdoms of ancient Egypt or medieval China. Hasn't the rise of modern science changed the basic rules of the human game? Wouldn't it be true to say that despite the ongoing importance of traditional myths, modern social systems rely increasingly on objective scientific theories such as the theory of evolution, which simply did not exist in ancient Egypt or medieval China? We could of course argue that scientific theories are a new kind of myth, and that our belief in science is no different from the ancient Egyptians' belief in the great god Sobek. Yet the comparison doesn't hold water. Sobek existed only in the collective imagination of his devotees. Praying to Sobek helped cement the Egyptian social system, thereby enabling people to build dams and canals that prevented floods and droughts. Yet the prayers themselves didn't raise or lower the Nile's water level by a millimeter. In contrast, scientific theories are not just a way to bind people together. It is often said that God helps those who help themselves. This is a roundabout way of saying that God doesn't exist, but if our belief in Him inspires us to do something ourselves, it helps. Antibiotics, unlike God, help even those who don't help themselves. They cure infections whether you believe in them or not. Consequently, the modern world is very different from the pre-modern world. Egyptian pharaohs and Chinese emperors failed to overcome famine, plague and war despite millennia of effort. Modern societies managed to do it within a few centuries. Isn't it the fruit of abandoning intersubjective myths in favor of objective scientific knowledge? And can't we expect this process to accelerate in the coming decades? As technology allows us to upgrade humans, overcome old age and find the key to happiness, so people would care less about fictional gods, nations and corporations, and focus instead on deciphering the physical and biological reality. In truth, however, things are far more complicated. Modern science certainly changed the rules of the game, but it did not simply replace myths with facts. Myths continue to dominate humankind. Science only makes these myths stronger. Instead of destroying the intersubjective reality, science will enable it to control the objective and subjective realities more completely than ever before. Thanks to computers and bioengineering, the difference between fiction and reality will blur, as people reshape reality to match their pet fictions. The priests of Sobek imagined the existence of divine crocodiles, while Pharaoh dreamt about immortality. In reality, the sacred crocodile was a very ordinary swamp reptile dressed in golden fineries, and Pharaoh was as mortal as the simplest of peasants. After death, his corpse was mummified using preservative balms and scented perfumes, but it was as lifeless as one can get. In contrast, 21st century scientists might be able to really engineer super crocodiles, and to provide the human elite with eternal youth here on Earth. Consequently, the rise of science will make at least some myths and religions mightier than ever. To understand why, and to face the challenges of the 21st century, we should therefore revisit one of the most nagging questions of all. How does modern science relate to religion? It seems that people have already said 1,000,000 times everything there is to say about this question. Yet in practice, science and religion are like a husband and wife, who after 500 years of marriage counseling still don't know each other. He still dreams about Cinderella, and she keeps pining for Prince Charming, while they argue about whose turn it is to take out the rubbish. Germs and demons. Most of the misunderstandings regarding science and religion result from faulty definitions of religion. All too often, people confuse religion with superstition, spirituality, belief in supernatural powers, or belief in gods. Religion is none of these things. Religion cannot be equated with superstition, because most people are unlikely to call their cherished beliefs superstitions. We always believe in the truth. It's only other people who believe in superstitions. Similarly, few people put their faith in supernatural powers. For those who believe in demons, demons aren't supernatural. They are an integral part of nature, just like porcupines, scorpions and germs. Modern physicians blame disease on invisible germs, and voodoo priests blame disease on invisible demons. There's nothing supernatural about it. You make some demon angry, so the demon enters your body and causes you pain. What could be more natural than that? Only those who don't believe in demons think of them as standing apart from the natural order of things. Equating religion with faith in supernatural powers implies that you can understand all known natural phenomena without religion, which is just an optional supplement. Having understood perfectly well the whole of nature, you can now choose whether to add some supernatural religious dogma or not. However, most religions argue that you simply cannot understand the world without them. You will never comprehend the true reason for disease, drought or earthquakes if you do not take their dogma into account. Defining religion as belief in gods is also problematic. We tend to say that a devout Christian is religious because she believes in God, whereas a fervent communist isn't religious because communism has no gods. However, religion is created by humans rather than by gods, and it is defined by its social function rather than by the existence of deities. Religion is anything that confers superhuman legitimacy on human social structures. It legitimizes human norms and values by arguing that they reflect superhuman laws. Religion asserts that we humans are subject to a system of moral laws that we did not invent and that we cannot change. A devout Jew would say that this is the system of moral laws created by God and revealed in the Bible. A Hindu would say that Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva created the laws, which were revealed to us humans in the Vedas. Other religions, from Buddhism and Taoism to Nazism, communism, and liberalism, argue that the superhuman laws are natural laws, and not the creation of this or that God. Of course, each believes in a different set of natural laws discovered and revealed by different seers and prophets, from Buddha and Laozi to Hitler and Lenin. A Jewish boy comes to his father and asks, "Dad, why shouldn't we eat pork?" The father strokes his long white beard thoughtfully and answers, "Well, Yankee, that's how the world works. You are still young and you don't understand, but if we eat pork, God will punish us and we will come to a bad end." It isn't my idea. It's not even the rabbi's idea. If the rabbi had created the world, maybe he would have created a world in which pork was perfectly kosher. But the rabbi didn't create the world, God did it. And God said, "I don't know why, that we shouldn't eat pork. So we shouldn't." Capiche? In 1943 a German boy comes to his father, a senior SS officer, and asks, "Dad, why are we killing the Jews?" The father puts on his shiny leather boots, and meanwhile explains, "Well, Fritz, that's how the world works. You are still young and you don't understand, but if we allow the Jews to live, they will cause the degeneration and extinction of humankind. It's not my idea, and it's not even the Führer's idea. If Hitler had created the world, maybe he would have created a world in which the laws of natural selection did not apply, and Jews and Aryans could all live together in perfect harmony. But Hitler didn't create the world. He just managed to decipher the laws of nature, and then instructed us how to live in line with them. If we disobey these laws, we will come to a bad end. Is that clear?" In 2016 a British boy comes to his father, a Liberal MP, and asks, "Dad, why should we care about the human rights of Muslims in the Middle East?" The father puts down his cup of tea, thinks for a moment, and says, "Well, Duncan, that's how the world works. You are still young and you don't understand, but all humans, even Muslims in the Middle East, have the same nature and therefore enjoy the same natural rights. This isn't my idea, nor a decision of Parliament. If Parliament had created the world, universal human rights might, well, have been buried in some subcommittee along with all that quantum physics stuff. But Parliament didn't create the world, it just tries to make sense of it. And we must respect the natural rights even of Muslims in the Middle East, or very soon our own rights will also be violated, and we will come to a bad end. Now off you go." Liberals, communists and followers of other modern creeds dislike describing their own system as a religion, because they identify religion with superstitions and supernatural powers. If you tell communists or liberals that they are religious, they think you accuse them of blindly believing in groundless pipe dreams. In fact, it means only that they believe in some system of moral laws that wasn't invented by humans, but which humans must nevertheless obey. As far as we know, all human societies believe in this. Every society tells its members that they must obey some superhuman moral law, and that breaking this law will result in catastrophe. Religions differ, of course, in the details of their stories, their concrete commandments, and the rewards and punishments they promise. Thus in medieval Europe the Catholic Church argued that God doesn't like rich people. Jesus said that it is harder for a rich man to pass through the gates of heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle, and the church encouraged the rich to give lots of alms, threatening that misers will burn in hell. Modern communism also dislikes rich people, but it threatens them with class conflict here and now, rather than with burning sulfur after death. The communist laws of history are similar to the commandments of the Christian God, inasmuch as they are superhuman forces that humans cannot change at will. People can decide tomorrow morning to cancel the offside rule in football, because we invented that law, and we are free to change it. However, at least according to Marx, we cannot change the laws of history. No matter what the capitalists do, as long as they continue to accumulate private property, they are bound to create class conflict, and they are destined to be defeated by the rising proletariat. If you happen to be a communist yourself, you might argue that communism and Christianity are nevertheless very different, because communism is right, whereas Christianity is wrong. Class conflict really is inherent in the capitalist system, whereas rich people don't suffer eternal tortures in hell after they die. Yet even if that's the case, it doesn't mean communism is not a religion. Rather, it means that communism is the one true religion. Followers of every religion are convinced that theirs alone is true. Perhaps the followers of one religion are right. If you meet the Buddha, the assertion that religion is a tool for preserving social order and for organizing large-scale cooperation may vex many people for whom it represents first and foremost a spiritual path. However, just as the gap between religion and science is smaller than we commonly think, so the gap between religion and spirituality is much bigger. Religion is a deal, whereas spirituality is a journey. Religion gives a complete description of the world, and offers us a well-defined contract with predetermined goals. God exists. He told us to behave in certain ways. If you obey God, you'll be admitted to heaven. If you disobey Him, you'll burn in hell. The very clarity of this deal allows society to define common norms and values that regulate human behavior. Spiritual journeys are nothing like that. They usually take people in mysterious ways towards unknown destinations. The quest usually begins with some big question, such as who am I? What is the meaning of life? What is good? Whereas many people just accept the ready-made answers provided by the powers that be, spiritual seekers are not so easily satisfied. They are determined to follow the big question wherever it leads, and not just to places you know well or wish to visit. Thus for most people, academic studies are a deal rather than a spiritual journey, because they take us to a predetermined goal approved by our elders, governments and banks. I'll study for 3 years, pass the exams, get my BA certificate, and secure a well-paid job. Academic studies might be transformed into a spiritual journey if the big questions you encounter on the way deflect you towards unexpected destinations, of which you could hardly even conceive at first. For example, a student might begin to study economics in order to secure a job in Wall Street. However, if what she learns somehow causes her to end up in a Hindu ashram, or helping HIV patients in Zimbabwe, then we might call that a spiritual journey. Why label such a voyage spiritual? This is a legacy from ancient dualist religions that believed in the existence of 2 gods, one good and one evil. According to dualism, the good God created pure and everlasting souls that lived in a wonderful world of spirit. However, the bad God, sometimes named Satan, created another world, made of matter. Satan didn't know how to make his creation last. Hence in the world of matter everything rots and disintegrates. In order to breathe life into his defective creation, Satan tempted souls from the pure world of spirit, and locked them up inside material bodies. That's what humans are, the good spiritual soul trapped inside an evil material body. Since the soul's prison, the body decays and eventually dies, Satan ceaselessly tempts the soul with bodily delights, and above all with food, sex and power. When the body disintegrates and the soul has a chance to escape back to the spiritual world, its craving for bodily pleasures draws it back inside some new material body. The soul thus transmigrates from body to body, wasting its days in pursuit of food, sex and power. Dualism instructs people to break these material shackles and undertake a journey back to the spiritual world, which is totally unfamiliar to us, but is our true home. During this quest, we must reject all material temptations and deals. Due to this dualist legacy, every journey on which we doubt the conventions and deals of the mundane world and walk towards an unknown destination is called a spiritual journey. Such journeys are fundamentally different from religions, because religions seek to cement the worldly order whereas spirituality seeks to escape it. Often enough, the most important demand from spiritual wanderers is to challenge the beliefs and conventions of dominant religions. In Zen Buddhism it is said that if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Which means that if while walking on the spiritual path, you encounter the rigid ideas and fixed laws of institutionalized Buddhism, you must free yourself from them too. For religions, spirituality is a dangerous threat. Religions typically strive to reign in the spiritual quests of their followers, and many religious systems were challenged not by laypeople preoccupied with food, sex and power, but rather by spiritual truth-seekers who wanted more than platitudes. Thus the Protestant revolt against the authority of the Catholic Church was ignited not by hedonistic atheists, but rather by a devout and ascetic monk, Martin Luther. Luther wanted answers to the existential questions of life, and refused to settle for the rites, rituals and deals offered by the Church. In Luther's day, the Church promised its followers very enticing deals. If you sinned, and feared eternal damnation in the afterlife, all you needed to do was buy an indulgence. In the early 16th century the Church employed professional salvation peddlers, who wandered the towns and villages of Europe, and sold indulgences for fixed prices. You want an entry visa to heaven? Pay 10 gold coins. You want Grandpa Heinz and Grandma Gertrude to join you there? No problem, but it will cost you 30 coins. The most famous of these peddlers, the Dominican friar Johannes Tetzel, allegedly said that the moment the coin clinks in the money chest, the soul flies out of purgatory to heaven. The more Luther thought about it, the more he doubted this deal and the church that offered it. You cannot just buy your way to salvation. The Pope couldn't possibly have the authority to forgive people their sins and open the gates of heaven. According to Protestant tradition, on the 31st of October 1517 Luther walked to the All Saints' Church in Wittenberg, carrying a lengthy document, a hammer and some nails. The document listed 95 theses against contemporary religious practices, including against the selling of indulgences. Luther nailed it to the church door, sparking the Protestant Reformation, which called upon any human who cared about salvation to rebel against the Pope's authority and search for alternative routes to heaven. Note: the Pope selling indulgences for money, from a Protestant pamphlet. From a historical perspective, the spiritual journey is always tragic, for it is a lonely path fit for individuals rather than for entire societies. Human cooperation requires firm answers rather than just questions, and those who foam against stultified religious structures end up forging new structures in their place. It happened to the dualists, whose spiritual journeys became religious establishments. It happened to Martin Luther, who after challenging the laws, institutions and rituals of the Catholic Church found himself writing new law books, founding new institutions, and inventing new ceremonies. It happened even to Buddha and Jesus. In their uncompromising quest for the truth they subverted the laws, rituals and structures of traditional Hinduism and Judaism. But eventually more laws, more rituals and more structures were created in their name than in the name of any other person in history. Counterfeiting God. Now that we have a better understanding of religion, we can go back to examining the relationship between religion and science. There are two extreme interpretations for this relationship. One view says that science and religion are sworn enemies, and that modern history was shaped by the life and death struggle of scientific knowledge against religious superstition. With time, the light of science dispelled the darkness of religion, and the world became increasingly secular, rational and prosperous. However, though some scientific findings certainly undermine religious dogmas, this is not inevitable. For example, Muslim dogma holds that Islam was founded by the Prophet Muhammad in 7th century Arabia, and there is ample scientific evidence supporting this. More importantly, science always needs religious assistance in order to create viable human institutions. Scientists study how the world functions, but there is no scientific method for determining how humans ought to behave. Science tells us that humans cannot survive without oxygen. However, is it okay to execute criminals by asphyxiation? Science doesn't know how to answer such a question. Only religions provide us with the necessary guidance. Hence, every practical project scientists undertake also relies on religious insights. Take, for example, the building of the Three Gorges Dam over the Yangtze River. When the Chinese government decided to build the dam, in 1992, physicists could calculate what pressures the dam would have to withstand, economists could forecast how much money it would probably cost, while electrical engineers could predict how much electricity it would produce. However, the government needed to take additional factors into account. Building the dam flooded huge territories containing many villages and towns, thousands of archaeological sites, and unique landscapes and habitats. More than 1 million people were displaced and hundreds of species were endangered. It seems that the dam directly caused the extinction of the Chinese river dolphin. No matter what you personally think about the Three Gorges Dam, it is clear that building it was an ethical rather than a purely scientific issue. No physics experiment, no economic model, and no mathematical equation can determine whether generating thousands of megawatts and making billions of yuan is more valuable than saving an ancient pagoda or the Chinese river dolphin. Consequently, China cannot function on the basis of scientific theories alone. It requires some religion or ideology, too. Some jump to the opposite extreme and say that science and religion are completely separate kingdoms. Science studies facts, religion speaks about values, and never the twain shall meet. Religion has nothing to say about scientific facts, and science should keep its mouth shut concerning religious convictions. If the Pope believes that human life is sacred, and abortion is therefore a sin, biologists can neither prove nor refute this claim. As a private individual, each biologist is welcome to argue with the Pope. But as a scientist, the biologist cannot enter the fray. This approach may sound sensible, but it misunderstands religion. Though science indeed deals only with facts, religion never confines itself to ethical judgments. Religion cannot provide us with any practical guidance unless it makes some factual claims too, and here it may well collide with science. The most important segments of many religious dogmas are not their ethical principles, but rather factual statements such as God exists, the soul is punished for its sins in the afterlife, the Bible was written by a deity rather than by humans, the Pope is never wrong. These are all factual claims. Many of the most heated religious debates, and many of the conflicts between science and religion, involve such factual claims rather than ethical judgments. Take abortion, for example. Devout Christians often oppose abortion, whereas many liberals support it. The main bone of contention is factual rather than ethical. Both Christians and liberals believe that human life is sacred, and that murder is a heinous crime. But they disagree about certain biological facts. Does human life begin at the moment of conception, at the moment of birth, or at some middle point? Indeed, some human cultures maintain that life doesn't begin even at birth. According to the Kung of the Kalahari Desert and to various Inuit groups in the Arctic, human life begins only after the person is given a name. When an infant is born, people wait for some time before naming it. If they decide not to keep the baby either because it suffers from some deformity, or because of economic difficulties, they kill it. Provided they do so before the naming ceremony, it is not considered murder. Two people from such cultures might well agree with liberals and Christians that human life is sacred and that murder is a terrible crime, yet they support infanticide. When religions advertise themselves, they tend to emphasize their beautiful values. But God often hides in the small print of factual statements. The Catholic religion markets itself as the religion of universal love and compassion. How wonderful! Who can object to that? Why, then, are not all humans Catholic? Because when you read the small print, you discover that Catholicism also demands blind obedience to a pope, who never makes mistakes even when he orders us to go on crusades and burn heretics at the stake. Such practical instructions are not deduced solely from ethical judgments. Rather, they result from conflating ethical judgments with factual statements. When we leave the ethereal sphere of philosophy and observe historical realities, we find that religious stories almost always include three parts. 1. Ethical judgments, such as human life is sacred. 2. Factual statements, such as human life begins at the moment of conception. 3. A conflation of the ethical judgments with the factual statements, resulting in practical guidelines such as you should never allow abortion, even a single day after conception. Science has no authority or ability to refute or corroborate the ethical judgments religions make. But scientists do have a lot to say about religious factual statements. For example, biologists are more qualified than priests to answer factual questions such as do human fetuses have a nervous system 1 week after conception? Can they feel pain? To make things clearer, let us examine in depth a real historical example that you rarely hear about in religious commercials, but that had a huge social and political impact in its time. In medieval Europe, the popes enjoyed far-reaching political authority. Whenever a conflict erupted somewhere in Europe, they claimed the authority to decide the issue. To establish their claim to authority, they repeatedly reminded Europeans of the donation of Constantine. According to this story, on the 30th of March 315 the Roman Emperor Constantine signed an official decree granting Pope Sylvester I and his heirs perpetual control of the western part of the Roman Empire. The popes kept this precious document in their archive, and used it as a powerful propaganda tool whenever they faced opposition from ambitious princes, quarrelsome cities, or rebellious peasants. People in medieval Europe had great respect for ancient imperial decrees. They strongly believed that kings and emperors were God's representatives, and they also believed that the older the document, the more authority it carried. Constantine in particular was revered, because he turned the Roman Empire from a pagan realm into a Christian empire. In a clash between the desires of some present-day city council and a decree issued by the great Constantine himself, it was obvious that people ought to obey the ancient document. Hence, whenever the Pope faced political opposition, he waived the donation of Constantine, demanding obedience. Not that it always worked. But the donation of Constantine was an important cornerstone of papal propaganda and of the medieval political order. When we examine the donation of Constantine closely, we find that this story is composed of three distinct parts. Ethical judgment. People ought to respect ancient imperial decrees more than present-day popular opinions. Factual statement. On the 30th of March 315, Emperor Constantine granted the Pope's dominion over Europe. Practical guideline: Europeans in 1315 ought to obey the Pope's commands. The ethical authority of ancient imperial decrees is far from self-evident. Most 21st century Europeans think that the wishes of present-day citizens trump the diktats of long-dead kings. However, science cannot join this ethical debate, because no experiment or equation can decide the matter. If a modern-day scientist time-traveled to medieval Europe, she couldn't prove to our ancestors that the decrees of ancient emperors are irrelevant to contemporary political disputes. Yet the story of Constantine's donation was based not just on ethical judgments. It also involved some very concrete factual statements, which science is highly qualified to either verify or falsify. In 1441, Lorenzo Valla, a Catholic priest and a pioneer linguist, published a scientific study proving that Constantine's donation was forged. Valla analyzed the style and grammar of the document and the various words and terms it contained. He showed that the document included words which were unknown in 4th century Latin, and that it was most probably forged about 400 years after Constantine's death. Moreover, the date appearing on the document is 30 March, in the year Constantine was consul for the 4th time, and Gallicanus was consul for the 1st time. In the Roman Empire, 2 consuls were elected each year, and it was customary to date documents by their consulate years. Unfortunately, Constantine's 4th consulate was in 315, whereas Gallicanus was elected consul for the 1st time only in 317. If this all-important document was indeed composed in Constantine's days, it would never have contained such a blatant mistake. It is as if Thomas Jefferson and his colleagues had dated the American Declaration of Independence 34 July 1776. Today all historians agree that the donation of Constantine was forged in the papal court sometime in the 8th century. Even though Valla never disputed the moral authority of ancient imperial decrees, his scientific study did undermine the practical guideline that Europeans must obey the Pope. On the 20th of December 2013, the Ugandan parliament passed the Anti-Homosexuality Act, which criminalized homosexual activities, penalizing some activities by life imprisonment. It was inspired and supported by evangelical Christian groups, which maintain that God prohibits homosexuality. As proof, they quote Leviticus 18 verse 22, "Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, that is detestable," and Leviticus 20 verse 13, "If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death, their blood will be on their own heads." In previous centuries, the same religious story was responsible for tormenting millions of people all over the world. This story can be briefly summarized as follows. Ethical judgment. Humans ought to obey God's commands. Factual statement. About 3,000 years ago, God commanded humans to avoid homosexual activities. Practical guideline. People should avoid homosexual activities. Is the story true? Scientists cannot argue with the judgment that humans ought to obey God. Personally, you may dispute it. You may believe that human rights trump divine authority, and if God orders us to violate human rights, we shouldn't listen to him. Yet there is no scientific experiment that can decide this issue. In contrast, science has a lot to say about the factual statement that 3,000 years ago the creator of the universe commanded members of the Homo sapiens species to abstain from boy-on-boy action. How do we know this statement is true? Examining the relevant literature reveals that though this statement is repeated in millions of books, articles and internet sites, they all rely on a single source, the Bible. If so, a scientist would ask, who composed the Bible and when? Note that this is a factual question, not a question of values. Devout Jews and Christians say that at least the book of Leviticus was dictated by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, and from that moment onwards, not a single letter was either added or deleted from it. But, the scientist would insist, how can we be sure of that? After all, the Pope argued that the donation of Constantine was composed by Constantine himself in the 4th century, when in fact it was forged 400 years later by the Pope's own clerks. We can now use an entire arsenal of scientific methods to determine who composed the Bible and when. Scientists have been doing exactly that for more than a century, and if you are interested, you can read whole books about their findings. To cut a long story short, most peer-reviewed scientific studies agree that the Bible is a collection of numerous different texts composed by different people in different times, and that these texts were not assembled into a single holy book until long after biblical times. For example, whereas King David probably lived around 1000 BC, it is commonly accepted that the Book of Deuteronomy was composed in the court of King Josiah of Judah, sometime around 620 BC, as part of a propaganda campaign aimed to strengthen Josiah's authority. Leviticus was compiled at an even later date, no earlier than 500 BC. As for the idea that the ancient Jews carefully preserved the biblical text, without adding or subtracting anything, scientists point out that biblical Judaism was not a scripture-based religion at all. Rather, it was a typical Iron Age cult, similar to many of its Middle Eastern neighbors. It had no synagogues, yeshivas, rabbis, or even a Bible. Instead, it had elaborate temple rituals, most of which involved sacrificing animals to a jealous sky god, so that he would bless his people with seasonal rains and military victories. Its religious elite consisted of priestly families, who owed everything to birth, and nothing to intellectual prowess. The mostly illiterate priests were busy with the temple ceremonies, and had little time for writing or studying any scriptures. During the Second Temple period, a rival religious elite was formed. Due partly to Persian and Greek influences, Jewish scholars who wrote and interpreted texts gained increasing prominence. These scholars eventually came to be known as rabbis, and the texts they compiled were christened the Bible. Rabbinical authority rested on individual intellectual abilities rather than on birth. The clash between the new literate elite and the old priestly families was inevitable. Luckily for the rabbis, the Romans torched Jerusalem and its temple while suppressing the Great Jewish Revolt, AD 70. With the temple in ruins, the priestly families lost their religious authority, their economic power base, and their very raison d'etre. Traditional Judaism, a Judaism of temples, priests, and head-splitting warriors, disappeared. Its place was taken by a new Judaism of books, rabbis, and hair-splitting scholars. The scholars' main forte was interpretation. They used this ability not only to explain how an almighty God allowed his temple to be destroyed, but also to bridge the immense gaps between the old Judaism described in biblical stories and the very different Judaism they created. Hence, according to our best scientific knowledge, the Leviticus injunctions against homosexuality reflect nothing grander than the biases of a few priests and scholars in ancient Jerusalem. Though science cannot decide whether people ought to obey God's commands, it has many relevant things to say about the provenance of the Bible. If Ugandan politicians think that the power that created the cosmos, the galaxies, and the black holes becomes terribly upset whenever two Homo sapiens males have a bit of fun together, then science can help disabuse them of this rather bizarre notion. Holy dogma. In truth, it is not always easy to separate ethical judgments from factual statements. Religions have the nagging tendency to turn factual statements into ethical judgments, thereby creating terrible confusion and obfuscating what should have been relatively simple debates. Thus, the factual statement "God wrote the Bible" all too often mutates into the ethical injunction, "You ought to believe that God wrote the Bible." Merely believing in this factual statement becomes a virtue, whereas doubting it becomes a terrible sin. Conversely, ethical judgments often hide within them factual statements that people don't bother to mention, because they think they have been proven beyond doubt. Thus, the ethical judgment "human life is sacred," which science cannot test, may shroud the factual statement "every human has an eternal soul," which is open for scientific debate. Similarly, when American nationalists proclaim that the American nation is sacred, this seemingly ethical judgment is in fact predicated on factual statements, such as "the USA has spearheaded most of the moral, scientific, and economic advances of the last few centuries." Whereas it is impossible to scientifically scrutinize the claim that the American nation is sacred, once we unpack this judgment, we may well examine scientifically whether the USA has indeed been responsible for a disproportionate share of moral, scientific, and economic breakthroughs. This has led some philosophers, such as Sam Harris, to argue that science can always resolve ethical dilemmas, because human values always hide within them some factual statements. Harris thinks all humans share a single supreme value, minimizing suffering and maximizing happiness, and all ethical debates are factual arguments concerning the most efficient way to maximize happiness. 5 Islamic fundamentalists want to reach heaven in order to be happy. Liberals believe that increasing human liberty maximizes happiness, and German nationalists think that everyone would be better off if they only allowed Berlin to run this planet. According to Harris, Islamists, liberals and nationalists have no ethical dispute. They have a factual disagreement about how best to realize their common goal. Yet even if Harris is right, and even if all humans cherish happiness, in practice it would be extremely difficult to use this insight to decide ethical disputes, particularly because we have no scientific definition or measurement of happiness. Consider the case of the Three Gorges Dam. Even if we agree that the ultimate aim of the project is to make the world a happier place, how can we tell whether generating cheap electricity contributes more to global happiness than protecting traditional lifestyles or saving the rare Chinese river dolphin? As long as we haven't deciphered the mysteries of consciousness, we cannot develop a universal measurement for happiness and suffering, and we don't know how to compare the happiness and suffering of different individuals, let alone different species. How many units of happiness are generated when a billion Chinese enjoy cheaper electricity? How many units of misery are produced when an entire dolphin species becomes extinct? Indeed, are happiness and misery mathematical entities that can be added or subtracted in the first place? Eating ice cream is enjoyable. Finding true love is more enjoyable. Do you think that if you just eat enough ice cream, the accumulated pleasure could ever equal the rapture of true love? Consequently, although science has much more to contribute to ethical debates than we commonly think, there is a line it cannot cross, at least not yet. Without the guiding hand of some religion, it is impossible to maintain large-scale social orders. Even universities and laboratories need religious backing. Religion provides the ethical justification for scientific research, and in exchange gets to influence the scientific agenda and the uses of scientific discoveries. Hence you cannot understand the history of science without taking religious beliefs into account. Scientists seldom dwell on this fact, but the scientific revolution itself began in one of the most dogmatic, intolerant, and religious societies in history. The witch hunt. We often associate science with the values of secularism and tolerance. If so, early modern Europe is the last place you would have expected a scientific revolution. Europe in the days of Columbus, Copernicus, and Newton had the highest concentration of religious fanatics in the world, and the lowest level of tolerance. The luminaries of the scientific revolution lived in a society that expelled Jews and Muslims, burned heretics wholesale, saw a witch in every cat-loving elderly lady, and started a new religious war every full moon. If you traveled to Cairo or Istanbul around 1600, you would find there a multicultural and tolerant metropolis, where Sunnis, Shiites, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Armenians, Copts, Jews and even the occasional Hindu lived side by side in relative harmony. Though they had their share of disagreements and riots, and though the Ottoman Empire routinely discriminated against people on religious grounds, it was a liberal paradise compared with Europe. If you then traveled to contemporary Paris or London, you would find cities awash with religious extremism, in which only those belonging to the dominant sect could live. In London they killed Catholics, in Paris they killed Protestants, the Jews had long been driven out, and nobody in his right mind would dream of letting any Muslims in. And yet, the scientific revolution began in London and Paris rather than in Cairo and Istanbul. It is customary to tell the history of modernity as a struggle between science and religion. In theory, both science and religion are interested above all in the truth, and because each upholds a different truth, they are doomed to clash. In fact, neither science nor religion cares that much about the truth, hence they can easily compromise, coexist, and even cooperate. Religion is interested above all in order. It aims to create and maintain the social structure. Science is interested above all in power. It aims to acquire the power to cure diseases, fight wars, and produce food. As individuals, scientists and priests may give immense importance to the truth, but as collective institutions, science and religion prefer order and power over truth. They can therefore make good bedfellows. The uncompromising quest for truth is a spiritual journey, which can seldom remain within the confines of either religious or scientific establishments. It would accordingly be far more correct to view modern history as the process of formulating a deal between science and one particular religion. Namely, humanism. Modern society believes in humanist dogmas, and uses science not in order to question these dogmas, but rather in order to implement them. In the 21st century, the humanist dogmas are unlikely to be replaced by pure scientific theories. However, the covenant linking science and humanism may well crumble and give way to a very different kind of deal between science and some new post-humanist religion. We will dedicate the next 2 chapters to understanding the modern covenant between science and humanism. The third and final part of the book will then explain why this covenant is disintegrating and what new deal might replace it. Chapter 6. The Modern Covenant. Modernity is a deal. All of us sign up to this deal on the day we are born, and it regulates our lives until the day we die. Very few of us can ever rescind or transcend this deal. It shapes our food, our jobs, and our dreams, and it decides where we dwell, whom we love, and how we pass away. At first sight, modernity looks like an extremely complicated deal, hence few try to understand what they have signed up to. It's like when you download some software and are asked to sign an accompanying contract, which is dozens of pages of legalese. You take one look at it, immediately scroll down to the last page, tick I agree, and forget about it. Yet in fact, modernity is a surprisingly simple deal. The entire contract can be summarized in a single phrase: humans agree to give up meaning in exchange for power. Up until modern times, most cultures believed that humans play a part in some great cosmic plan. The plan was devised by the omnipotent gods, or by the eternal laws of nature, and humankind could not change it. The cosmic plan gave meaning to human life, but also restricted human power. Humans were much like actors on a stage. The script gave meaning to their every word, tear, and gesture, but placed strict limits on their performance. Hamlet cannot murder Claudius in Act 1, or leave Denmark and go to an ashram in India. Shakespeare won't allow it. Similarly, humans cannot live forever, they cannot escape all diseases, and they cannot do as they please. It's not in the script. In exchange for giving up power, pre-modern humans believed that their lives gained meaning. It really mattered whether they fought bravely on the battlefield, whether they supported the lawful king, whether they ate forbidden foods for breakfast, or whether they had an affair with the next-door neighbor. This created some inconveniences, of course, but it gave humans psychological protection against disasters. If something terrible happened, such as war, plague, or drought, people consoled themselves that we all play a role in some great cosmic drama, devised by the gods, or by the laws of nature. We are not privy to the script, but we can rest assured that everything happens for a purpose. Even this terrible war, plague, and drought have their place in the greater scheme of things. Furthermore, we can count on the playwright that the story surely has a good ending. So even the war, plague, and drought will work out for the best, if not here and now, then in the afterlife. Modern culture rejects this belief in a great cosmic plan. We are not actors in any larger-than-life drama. Life has no script, no playwright, no director, no producer, and no meaning. To the best of our scientific understanding, the universe is a blind and purposeless process, full of sound and fury, but signifying nothing. During our infinitesimally brief stay on our tiny speck of a planet, we fret and strut this way and that, and then are heard of no more. Since there is no script, and since humans fulfill no role in any great drama, terrible things might befall us and no power will come to save us, or give meaning to our suffering. There won't be a happy ending, or a bad ending, or any ending at all. Things just happen, one after the other. The modern world does not believe in purpose, only in cause. If modernity has a motto, it is shit happens. On the other hand, if shit just happens, without any binding script or purpose, then humans too are not limited to any predetermined role. We can do anything we want provided we can find a way. We are constrained by nothing except our own ignorance. Plagues and droughts have no cosmic meaning, but we can eradicate them. Wars are not a necessary evil on the way to a better future, but we can make peace. No paradise awaits us after death, but we can create paradise here on earth, and live in it forever, if we just manage to overcome some technical difficulties. If we invest money in research, then scientific breakthroughs will accelerate technological progress. New technologies will fuel economic growth, and a growing economy could dedicate even more money to research. With each passing decade, we will enjoy more food, faster vehicles, and better medicines. One day our knowledge will be so vast and our technology so advanced that we could distill the elixir of eternal youth, the elixir of true happiness, and any other drug we might possibly desire, and no God will stop us. The modern deal thus offers humans an enormous temptation, coupled with a colossal threat. Omnipotence is in front of us, almost within our reach, but below us yawns the abyss of complete nothingness. On the practical level, modern life consists of a constant pursuit of power within a universe devoid of meaning. Modern culture is the most powerful in history, and it is ceaselessly researching, inventing, discovering, and growing. At the same time, it is plagued by more existential angst than any previous culture. This chapter discusses the modern pursuit of power. The next chapter will examine how humankind has used its growing power to somehow sneak meaning back into the infinite emptiness of the cosmos. Yes, we moderns have promised to renounce meaning in exchange for power, but there's nobody out there to hold us to our promise. We think we are smart enough to enjoy the full benefits of the modern deal without paying its price. Why bankers are different from vampires. The modern pursuit of power is fueled by the alliance between scientific progress and economic growth. For most of history, science progressed at a snail's pace, while the economy was in deep freeze. The gradual increase in human population did lead to a corresponding increase in production, and sporadic discoveries sometimes resulted even in per capita growth. But this was a very slow process. If in AD 1100 villagers produced 100 tons of wheat, and in AD 1100, 105 villagers produced 107 tons of wheat, this growth didn't change the rhythms of life or the socio-political order. Whereas today everyone is obsessed with growth, in the pre-modern era people were oblivious to it. Princes, priests and peasants assumed that human production was more or less stable, that one person could enrich himself only by pilfering somebody else, and that their grandchildren were unlikely to enjoy a better standard of living. This stagnation resulted to a large extent from the difficulties involved in financing new projects. Without proper funding, it wasn't easy to drain swamps, construct bridges and build ports, not to mention engineer new wheat strains, discover new energy sources, or open new trade routes. Funds were scarce because there was little credit in those days. There was little credit because people had no belief in growth, and people didn't believe in growth because the economy was stagnant. Stagnation thereby perpetuated itself. Suppose you live in a medieval town that suffers from annual outbreaks of dysentery. You resolve to find a cure. You need funding to set up a lab, buy medicinal herbs and exotic chemicals, pay assistants and travel to consult with famous doctors. You also need money to feed yourself and your family while you are busy with your research. But you don't have much money. You can approach the local lumberjack, blacksmith and baker, and ask them to fulfill all your needs for a few years, promising that when you finally discover the cure and become rich, you will pay your debts. Unfortunately, the lumberjack, blacksmith, and baker are unlikely to agree. They need to feed their families today, and they have no faith in miracle medicines. They weren't born yesterday, and in all their years they have never heard of anyone finding a new medicine for some dreaded disease. If you want provisions, you must pay cash. But how can you have enough money when you haven't discovered the medicine yet, and all your time is taken up with research? Reluctantly, you go back to tilling your field. Dysentery keeps tormenting the townsfolk, nobody tries to develop new remedies, and not a single gold coin changes hands. That's how the economy froze, and science stood still. The cycle was eventually broken in the modern age thanks to people's growing trust in the future, and the resulting miracle of credit. Credit is the economic manifestation of trust. Today, if I want to develop a new drug, but I don't have enough money, I can get a loan from the bank, or turn to private investors and venture capital funds. When Ebola erupted in West Africa in the summer of 2014, what do you think happened to the shares of pharmaceutical companies that were busy developing anti-Ebola drugs and vaccines? They skyrocketed. Techmira shares rose by 50% and BioCRYST shares by 90%. In the Middle Ages, the outbreak of a plague caused people to raise their eyes towards heaven and pray to God to forgive them for their sins. Today, when people hear of some new deadly epidemic, they pick up the phone and call their broker. For the stock exchange, even an epidemic is a business opportunity. If enough new ventures succeed, people's trust in the future increases, credit expands, interest rates fall, entrepreneurs can raise money more easily and the economy grows. People consequently have even greater trust in the future, the economy keeps growing and science progresses with it. It sounds simple on paper. Why, then, did humankind have to wait until the modern era for economic growth to gather momentum? For thousands of years people had little faith in future growth, not because they were stupid, but because it contradicts our gut feelings, our evolutionary heritage, and the way the world works. Most natural systems exist in equilibrium, and most survival struggles are a zero-sum game, in which one can prosper only at the expense of another. For example, each year roughly the same amount of grass grows in a given valley. The grass supports a population of about 10,000 rabbits, which contains enough slow, dim-witted or unlucky rabbits to provide prey for 100 foxes. If one fox is very diligent and captures more rabbits than usual, then another fox will probably starve to death. If all foxes somehow manage to capture more rabbits simultaneously, the rabbit population will crash, and next year many foxes will starve. Even though there are occasional fluctuations in the rabbit market, in the long run the foxes cannot expect to hunt, say, 3% more rabbits per year than the preceding year. Of course, some ecological realities are more complex, and not all survival struggles are zero-sum games. Many animals cooperate effectively, and a few even give loans. The most famous lenders in nature are vampire bats. These vampires congregate in their thousands inside caves, and every night they fly out to look for prey. When they find a sleeping bird or a careless mammal, they make a small incision in its skin and suck its blood. Not all bats find a victim every night. In order to cope with the uncertainty of their life, the vampires loan blood to each other. A vampire that fails to find prey will come home and ask for some stolen blood from a more fortunate friend. Vampires remember very well to whom they loaned blood, so at a later date if the friend comes home empty-handed, he will approach his debtor, who will return the favor. However, unlike human bankers, vampires never charge interest. If vampire A loaned vampire B 10 centiliters of blood, B will repay the same amount. Nor do vampires use loans in order to finance new businesses, or encourage growth in the blood-sucking market. Because the blood is produced by other animals, the vampires have no way of increasing production. Though the blood market has its ups and downs, vampires cannot presume that in 2017 there will be 3% more blood than in 2016, and that in 2018 the blood market will again grow by 3%. Consequently, vampires don't believe in growth. 1 For millions of years of evolution, humans lived under similar conditions to vampires, foxes and rabbits. Hence humans too find it difficult to believe in growth. The miracle pie. Evolutionary pressures have accustomed humans to see the world as a static pie. If somebody gets a bigger slice of the pie, somebody else inevitably gets a smaller slice. A particular family or city may prosper, but humankind as a whole is not going to produce more than it produces today. Accordingly, traditional religions, such as Christianity and Islam, sought ways to solve humanity's problems with the help of current resources, either by redistributing the existing pie, or by promising us a pie in the sky. Modernity, in contrast, is based on the firm belief that economic growth is not only possible, but is absolutely essential. Prayers, good deeds and meditation can be comforting and inspiring, but problems such as famine, plague and war can only be solved through growth. This fundamental dogma can be summarized in one simple idea: if you have a problem, you probably need more stuff, and in order to have more stuff, you must produce more of it. Modern politicians and economists insist that growth is vital for 3 principal reasons. Firstly, when we produce more, we can consume more, raise our standard of living and allegedly enjoy a happier life. Secondly, as long as humankind multiplies, economic growth is needed merely to stay where we are. For example, in India the annual population growth rate is 1.2%. That means that unless the Indian economy grows each year by at least 1.2%, unemployment will rise, salaries will fall and the average standard of living will decline. Thirdly, even if Indians stop multiplying, and even if the Indian middle class can be satisfied with its present standard of living, what should India do about its hundreds of millions of poverty-stricken citizens? If the economy doesn't grow, and the pie therefore remains the same size, you can give more to the poor only by taking something from the rich. That will force you to make some very hard choices, and will probably cause a lot of resentment and even violence. If you wish to avoid hard choices, resentment and violence, you need a bigger pie. Modernity has turned more stuff into a panacea applicable to almost all public and private problems, from Islamic fundamentalism through third world authoritarianism down to a failed marriage. If only countries such as Pakistan and Egypt could keep a healthy growth rate, their citizens would come to enjoy the benefits of private cars and bulging refrigerators, and they would take the path of earthly prosperity instead of following the Islamic Pied Piper. Similarly, economic growth in countries such as Congo and Myanmar would produce a prosperous middle class, which is the bedrock of liberal democracy. And in the case of the disgruntled couple, their marriage will be saved if they just buy a bigger house, so they don't have to share a cramped office, purchase a dishwasher, so that they stop arguing whose turn it is to do the dishes, and go to expensive therapy sessions twice a week. Economic growth has thus become the crucial juncture where almost all modern religions, ideologies and movements meet. The Soviet Union, with its megalomaniac 5-year plans, was as obsessed with growth as the most cutthroat American robber baron. Just as Christians and Muslims both believed in heaven and disagreed only about how to get there, so during the Cold War both capitalists and communists believed in creating heaven on earth through economic growth, and wrangled only about the exact method. Today Hindu revivalists, pious Muslims, Japanese nationalists and Chinese communists may declare their adherence to very different values and goals, but they have all come to believe that economic growth is the key for realizing their disparate goals. Thus in 2014, the devout Hindu Narendra Modi was elected Prime Minister of India largely thanks to his success in boosting economic growth in his home state of Gujarat, and thanks to the widely held view that only he could reinvigorate the sluggish national economy. Analogous views have kept the Islamist Recep Tayyip Erdogan in power in Turkey since 2003. The name of his party, the Justice and Development Party, highlights its commitment to economic development, and the Erdogan government has indeed managed to maintain impressive growth rates for more than a decade. Japan's Prime Minister, the nationalist Shinzo Abe, came to office in 2012 pledging to jolt the Japanese economy out of 2 decades of stagnation. His aggressive and somewhat unusual measures to achieve this have been nicknamed Abenomics. Meanwhile, in neighboring China, the Communist Party still pays lip service to traditional Marxist-Leninist ideals, but in practice, it is guided by Deng Xiaoping's famous maxims that development is the only hard truth and that it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. Which means, in plain language, do anything it takes to promote economic growth, even if Marx and Lenin wouldn't have been happy with it. In Singapore, as befits that no-nonsense city-state, they followed this line of thinking even further, and pegged ministerial salaries to the national GDP. When the Singaporean economy grows, ministers get a raise, as if that is what their job is all about. This obsession with growth may sound self-evident, but only because we live in the modern world. It wasn't like this in the past. Indian Maharajas, Ottoman sultans, Kamakura shoguns, and Han emperors seldom staked their political fortunes on ensuring economic growth. That Modi, Erdogan, Abe, and Chinese President Xi Jinping all bet their careers on economic growth testifies to the almost religious status growth has managed to acquire throughout the world. Indeed, it may not be wrong to call the belief in economic growth a religion, because it now purports to solve many, if not most, of our ethical dilemmas. Since economic growth is allegedly the source of all good things, it encourages people to bury their ethical disagreements and adopt whichever course of action maximizes long-term growth. The credo of more stuff accordingly urges individuals, firms, and governments to discount anything that might hamper economic growth, such as preserving social equality, ensuring ecological harmony, or honoring your parents. In the Soviet Union, when people thought that state-controlled communism was the fastest way to grow, anything that stood in the way of collectivization was bulldozed, including millions of kulaks, the freedom of expression, and the Aral Sea. Nowadays it is generally accepted that some version of free market capitalism is a much more efficient way of ensuring long-term growth, hence rich farmers and freedom of expression are protected, but ecological habitats, social structures, and traditional values that stand in the way of free market capitalism are destroyed and dismantled. Take, for example, a software engineer making $250 per hour working for some high-tech startup. One day her elderly father has a stroke. He now needs help with shopping, cooking, and even showering. She could move her father to her own house, leave home later in the morning, come back earlier in the evening and take care of her father personally. Both her income and the startup's productivity would suffer, but her father would enjoy the care of a respectful and loving daughter. Alternatively, the engineer could hire a Mexican carer who, for $25 per hour, would live with the father and provide for all his needs. That would mean business as usual for the engineer and her startup, and even the carer and the Mexican economy would benefit. What should the engineer do? Free market capitalism has a firm answer. If economic growth demands that we loosen family bonds, encourage people to live away from their parents, and import carers from the other side of the world, so be it. This answer, however, involves an ethical judgment rather than a factual statement. No doubt, when some people specialize in software engineering while others spend their time taking care of the elderly, we can produce more software and give old people more professional care. Yet is economic growth more important than family bonds? By daring to make such ethical judgments, free market capitalism has crossed the border from the land of science to that of religion. Most capitalists would probably dislike the title of religion, but as religions go, capitalism can at least hold its head high. Unlike other religions that promise us a pie in the sky, capitalism promises miracles here on earth and sometimes even provides them. Much of the credit for overcoming famine and plague belongs to the ardent capitalist faith in growth. Capitalism even deserves some kudos for reducing human violence and increasing tolerance and cooperation. As the next chapter explains, there are additional factors at play here, but capitalism did make an important contribution to global harmony by encouraging people to stop viewing the economy as a zero-sum game, in which your profit is my loss, and instead see it as a win-win situation, in which your profit is also my profit. This has probably helped global harmony far more than centuries of Christian preaching about loving your neighbor and turning the other cheek. From its belief in the supreme value of growth, capitalism deduces its number one commandment: thou shalt invest thy profits in increasing growth. For most of history, princes and priests wasted their profits on flamboyant carnivals, sumptuous palaces, and unnecessary wars. Alternatively, they put gold coins in an iron chest, sealed it and buried it in a dungeon. Today, devout capitalists use their profits to hire new employees, enlarge the factory, or develop a new product. If they don't know how to do it themselves, they give their money to somebody who does, such as bankers and venture capitalists. The latter lend the money to various entrepreneurs. Farmers take loans to plant new wheat fields, contractors build new houses, energy corporations explore new oil fields, and arms factories develop new weapons. The profits from all these activities enable the entrepreneurs to repay the loans with interest. We now have not only more wheat, houses, oil and weapons, but also more money, which the banks and funds can again lend. This wheel will never stop, at least not according to capitalism. We will never reach a moment when capitalism says, that's it. You have grown enough. You can now take it easy. If you want to know why the capitalist wheel is unlikely ever to stop, talk for an hour with a friend who has just earned $100,000 and wonders what to do with it. The banks offer such low interest rates, he would complain. I don't want to put my money in a savings account that pays hardly 0.5% a year. You can make perhaps 2% in government bonds. My cousin Richie bought a flat in Seattle last year, and he has already made 20% on his investment. Maybe I should go into real estate too, but everybody is saying there's a new real estate bubble. So what do you think about the stock exchange? A friend told me the best deal these days is to buy an ETF that follows emerging economies, like Brazil or China. As he stops for a moment to breathe, you ask, well, why not just be satisfied with your $100,000? He will explain to you better than I can why capitalism will never stop. This lesson is hammered home even to children and teenagers through ubiquitous capitalist games. Pre-modern games such as chess assumed a stagnant economy. You begin a game of chess with 16 pieces, and you never finish a game with more. In rare cases a pawn may be transformed into a queen, but you cannot produce new pawns, nor can you upgrade your knights into tanks. So chess players never have to think about investment. In contrast, many modern board games and computer games revolve around investment and growth. Particularly telling are civilization-style strategy games, such as Minecraft, The Settlers of Catan, or Sid Meier's Civilization. The game may be set in the Middle Ages, in the Stone Age, or in some imaginary fairy land, but the principles always remain the same and they are always capitalist. Your aim is to establish a city, a kingdom, or maybe an entire civilization. You begin from a very modest base, perhaps just a village and its nearby fields. Your assets provide you with an initial income of wheat, wood, iron or gold. You then have to invest this income wisely. You have to choose between unproductive, but still necessary tools such as soldiers, and productive assets, such as more villages, fields and mines. The winning strategy is usually to invest the barest minimum in non-productive essentials, while maximizing your productive assets. Establishing additional villages means that next turn you will have a larger income, that would enable you not only to buy more soldiers, if necessary, but simultaneously to increase your investment in production. Soon you could upgrade your villages to towns, build universities, harbors and factories, explore the seas and oceans, establish your civilization and win the game. The Ark Syndrome. Yet can the economy actually keep growing forever? Won't it eventually run out of resources and grind to a halt? In order to ensure perpetual growth, we must somehow discover an inexhaustible store of resources. One solution is to explore and conquer new lands and territories. For centuries, the growth of the European economy and the expansion of the capitalist system indeed relied heavily on overseas imperial conquests. However, there are only so many islands and continents on Earth. Some entrepreneurs hope eventually to explore and conquer new planets and even galaxies, but in the meantime, the modern economy has had to find a better method of expanding. Science has provided modernity with the alternative. The fox economy cannot grow, because foxes don't know how to produce more rabbits. The rabbit economy stagnates, because rabbits cannot make the grass grow faster. But the human economy can grow, because humans can discover new materials and sources of energy. The traditional view of the world as a pie of a fixed size presupposes there are only two kinds of resources in the world: raw materials and energy. But in truth, there are three kinds of resources: raw materials, energy and knowledge. Raw materials and energy are exhaustible. The more you use, the less you have. Knowledge, in contrast, is a growing resource. The more you use, the more you have. Indeed, when you increase your stock of knowledge, it can give you more raw materials and energy as well. If I invest $100 million searching for oil in Alaska and I find it, then I now have more oil, but my grandchildren will have less of it. In contrast, if I invest $100 million researching solar energy, and I find a new and more efficient way of harnessing it, then both I and my grandchildren will have more energy. For thousands of years, the scientific road to growth was blocked because people believed that holy scriptures and ancient traditions already contained all the important knowledge the world had to offer. A corporation that believed all the oil fields in the world had already been discovered would not waste time and money searching for oil. Similarly, a human culture that believed it already knew everything worth knowing would not bother searching for new knowledge. This was the position of most pre-modern human civilizations. However, the scientific revolution freed humankind from this conviction. The greatest scientific discovery was the discovery of ignorance. Once humans realized how little they knew about the world, they suddenly had a very good reason to seek new knowledge, which opened up the scientific road to progress. With each passing generation, science helped discover fresh sources of energy, new kinds of raw material, better machinery, and novel production methods. Consequently, in 2016 humankind commands far more energy and raw materials than ever before, and production skyrockets. Inventions such as the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, and the computer have created whole new industries from scratch. As we look 20 years to the future, we confidently expect to produce and consume far more in 2036 than we do today. We trust nanotechnology, genetic engineering, and artificial intelligence to revolutionize production yet again, and to open whole new sections in our ever-expanding supermarkets. We therefore have a good chance of overcoming the problem of resource scarcity. The real nemesis of the modern economy is ecological collapse. Both scientific progress and economic growth take place within a brittle biosphere, and as they gather steam, so the shock waves destabilize the ecology. In order to provide every person in the world with the same standard of living as affluent Americans, we would need a few more planets, but we only have this one. If progress and growth do end up destroying the ecosystem, the cost will be dear not merely to vampires, foxes and rabbits, but also to sapiens. An ecological meltdown will cause economic ruin, political turmoil, a fall in human standards of living, and it might threaten the very existence of human civilization. We could lessen the danger by slowing down the pace of progress and growth. If this year investors expect to get a 6% return on their portfolios, in 10 years they will be satisfied with a 3% return, in 20 years only 1%, and in 30 years the economy will stop growing, and we'll be happy with what we've already got. Yet the creed of growth firmly objects to such a heretical idea. Instead, it suggests we should run even faster. If our discoveries destabilize the ecosystem and threaten humanity, then we should discover something to protect ourselves. If the ozone layer dwindles and exposes us to skin cancer, we should invent better sunscreen and better cancer treatments, thereby also promoting the growth of new sunscreen factories and cancer centers. If all the new industries pollute the atmosphere and the oceans, causing global warming and mass extinctions, then we should build for ourselves virtual worlds and high-tech sanctuaries that will provide us with all the good things in life even if the planet is as hot, dreary and polluted as hell. Beijing has already become so polluted that people avoid the outdoors, and wealthy Chinese pay thousands of dollars for indoor air purifying systems. The super-rich build protective contraptions even over their yards. In 2013, the International School of Beijing, which caters for the children of foreign diplomats and upper-class Chinese, went a step further and constructed a giant $5 million dome over its 6 tennis courts and its playing fields. Other schools are following suit, and the Chinese air purification market is booming. Of course, most Beijing residents cannot afford such luxuries in their homes, nor can they afford to send their kids to the international school. Humankind finds itself locked into a double race. On the one hand, we feel compelled to speed up the pace of scientific progress and economic growth. 1 billion Chinese and 1 billion Indians want to live like middle-class Americans, and they see no reason why they should put their dreams on hold when the Americans are unwilling to give up their SUVs and shopping malls. On the other hand, we must stay at least one step ahead of ecological Armageddon. Managing this double race becomes more difficult by the year, because every stride that brings the Delhi slum dwellers closer to the American dream also brings the planet closer to the brink. The good news is that for hundreds of years humankind has enjoyed a growing economy without falling prey to ecological meltdown. Many other species have perished in the process, and humans too have faced a number of economic crises and ecological disasters, but so far we have always managed to pull through. Yet future success is not guaranteed by some law of nature. Who knows if science will always be able to simultaneously save the economy from freezing and the ecology from boiling. And since the pace just keeps accelerating, the margins for error keep narrowing. If previously it was enough to invent something amazing once a century, today we need to come up with a miracle every 2 years. We should also be concerned that an ecological apocalypse might have different consequences for different human castes. There is no justice in history. When disaster strikes, the poor almost always suffer far more than the rich, even if the rich caused the tragedy in the first place. Global warming is already affecting the lives of poor people in arid African countries more than the lives of affluent Westerners. Paradoxically, the very power of science may increase the danger, because it makes the rich complacent. Consider greenhouse gas emissions. Most scholars and an increasing number of politicians recognize the reality of global warming and the magnitude of the danger. Yet this recognition has so far failed to change our actual behavior. We talk a lot about global warming, but in practice humankind is unwilling to make serious economic, social or political sacrifices to stop the catastrophe. Between 2000 and 2010 emissions didn't decrease at all. On the contrary, they increased at an annual rate of 2.2%, compared with an annual increase rate of 1.3% between 1970 and 2000. For the 1997 Kyoto Protocol on Reduction of Greenhouse Gas Emissions aimed merely to slow down global warming rather than stop it. Yet the world's number one polluter, the United States, refused to ratify it, and has made no attempt to significantly reduce its emissions, for fear of slowing down its economic growth. Note, all the talk about global warming, and all the conferences, summits and protocols, have so far failed to curb global greenhouse emissions. If you look closely at the graph, you see that emissions go down only during periods of economic crises and stagnation. Thus, the small downturn in greenhouse emissions in 2008-9 was due not to the signing of the Copenhagen Accord, but to the global financial crisis. In December 2015, more ambitious targets were set in the Paris Agreement, which calls for limiting average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But many of the painful steps necessary to reach this aim have conveniently been postponed to after 2030, or even to the second half of the 21st century, effectively passing the hot potato to the next generation. Current administrations would be able to reap immediate political benefits from looking green, while the heavy political price of reducing emissions and slowing growth is bequeathed to future administrations. Even so, at the time of writing, January 2016, it is far from certain that the USA and other leading polluters will ratify the Paris Agreement. Too many politicians and voters believe that as long as the economy grows, scientists and engineers could always save us from doomsday. When it comes to climate change, many growth true believers do not just hope for miracles, they take it for granted that the miracles will happen. How rational is it to risk the future of humankind on the assumption that future scientists will make some unknown discoveries? Most of the presidents, ministers, and CEOs who run the world are very rational people. Why are they willing to take such a gamble? Maybe because they don't think they are gambling on their own personal future. Even if bad comes to worse and science cannot hold off the deluge, engineers could still build a high-tech Noah's Ark for the upper caste, while leaving billions of others to drown. The belief in this high-tech ark is currently one of the biggest threats to the future of humankind and of the entire ecosystem. People who believe in the high-tech ark should not be put in charge of the global ecology, for the same reason that people who believe in a heavenly afterlife should not be given nuclear weapons. And what about the poor? Why aren't they protesting? If and when the deluge comes, they will bear the full cost of it. However, they will also be the first to bear the cost of economic stagnation. In a capitalist world, the lives of the poor improve only when the economy grows. Hence, they are unlikely to support any steps to reduce future ecological threats that are based on slowing down present-day economic growth. Protecting the environment is a very nice idea, but those who cannot pay their rent are worried about their overdraft far more than about melting ice caps.